Oh, hey everybody. Well, today's topic is so dense in material, it's going to take 2 videos. Otherwise, I'd end up with like an hour-long video and nobody would watch it. So this will be part 1 of pressure fermenting. Now, I have done a video on pressure fermenting before. And I've also done a video, I think, on spunding valves, although that was mostly how to clean your spunding valve. Anyway, so this is kind of a combination of both. I'm not going to clean the spunding valve, but there is videos like that on my channel. All right, let's get moving here because, like I said, this is a lot of material to cover. And I think that even if you're a regular pressure fermenter, you may find some new information in this video. So hopefully you'll listen through the whole thing and then go watch part 2 when I post it next week. Am I going to post it next week? Yeah, I'll post it next week. All right. So let's start with the benefits of pressure fermenting. And by the way, cheers. My last of my daily drinker. This has been out of stock 2 weeks in a row now, so I wonder if something's happened and 10 Bell Brewing is not making this beer anymore. That'll be a shame to me. Anyway, benefits of pressure fermenting. Number 1, it lowers the ester production of fusel alcohols in your fermentation, during your fermentation. So, for example, you could brew a lager at room temperature, 70 degrees, and still obtain that like traditional lager flavor, even though you're brewing it, or not brewing, but fermenting it at 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So you don't have to necessarily have a way to chill the beer, as long as your ambient temperature is not crazy high. All right, so that's number 1. Lower. I hate to use the phrase, it lowers your off flavors, but it lowers your ester production and fusel alcohols. And keep in mind, that means that not all beers are really benefited from being pressure fermented. Number 2, being able to ferment at higher temperatures without producing set off flavors. It's kind of the same as number 1, I guess. Number 3, benefit for pressure fermenting, having your beer carbonated by the end of your fermentation. Now, there's an asterisk to this one, in my opinion. It is really impossible, unless just by sheer luck, to properly carbonate a beer just by doing pressure fermenting and have it be the carbonation level that you want for that beer. We'll get into that later in the video, but yes, you can. I mean, one of the side effects of pressure fermenting is it's holding in all the gas, right? But it's not so easy to really dial in how much pressure in there you want. I'll get to it. Number 4, benefit from pressure fermenting, reduced krausen. Now, that's my personal reason most of the time for pressure fermenting. Basically, if you don't have a lot of headspace, maybe you're fermenting in a corny keg, and you're doing 4.5 gallons and you only have a half gallon of headspace. Well, if you do it under pressure, you're going to be okay most likely, because it just doesn't produce that volatile krausen that you get when you don't have it under pressure. Now, let us talk about what is a pressure fermenter called, because I'm calling it a pressure fermenter. That's more the that's more like the of what you're doing. You're pressure fermenting. I don't know if I'd call it a pressure fermenter. If you're not familiar with the term, this is usually found in commercial brewing, but they're called unitanks. So if you've ever heard that before, that's what it is. A unitank is basically a pressure or pressurizable fermenter. All right, you can use it for both fermentation and carbonating. And personally, I even serve directly from a unitank and basically use it as a keg. So it's my fermenter and my keg all in one. There is a caveat there, which is you need a floating dip tube if you're going to serve directly off of it. And also, there's a limit on how long you want the beer sitting on the yeast cake. honestly, it can sit there for a good 2-3 months. I've done it, and it doesn't really have any effect on clarity or flavor. But at some point, you're going to have problems if you leave it too long on that yeast. So you don't want it to sit and age. If you're one of those people that brews like 6 beers all at once and then doesn't brew again for another year, and you're just drinking the beer that you have already brewed, yeah, you don't want to do that. Don't leave it on the yeast. That's too long. All right, let's go to the next topic. Spunding valves. Yes, let's talk about spunding valves, because this is directly related to pressure fermenting. I got one right here, actually. This is, I think, one of my original ones, too. This is a Northern Brewer spunding valve, and I like it because it's accurate. Maybe because it's, you know, all metal or brass, but I like it. It's one of the better working ones that I have. So there are 2 kinds of spunding valves. There is this kind, which is the spring and poppet style. Now, I did a video where I took them apart and cleaned them and stuff. In fact, I did with this one. If you want to watch that video, go for it. You can see the inner workings of these things, but basically in here there's a spring and a poppet, just like you have in your connector here that goes to your keg, right? And then there's another style. They look similar, but they're called a diaphragm style of spunding valve. Now, which is better? The spring and poppet, like this one, or the diaphragm? Well, I don't know, because like I said, I do like this one quite a bit. It's worked really well for me, and it's been pretty accurate. That being said, they say this poppet style is not as good. Poppets are a small area by comparison to the diaphragm, right? I can't explain it unless you've ever taken one of these apart and looked and seen what, you know, what the poppet looks like. It's just a little stick, almost like a little toothpick, a little bigger than a toothpick, but with a spring on it. So it's a small area, right, to try to hold and give you accurate pressure, as opposed to a diaphragm, which are not huge, but they're spread out, right? The poppet design is more sensitive. So that means that you have less stable pressure regulation. It's harder to really dial it in. Whereas the diaphragm style are not as sensitive and are better at holding that level that you set it to. So for those reasons, a lot of people consider the diaphragm version better. All right, more about the spunding valve. Pressure capability. They're going to have a dial of some sort. The deal is, like, this one goes to 15 psi. This one does. Some of them can handle more than others. Here's why this is important. If you are just trying to reduce the esters in a lager that you're brewing, then you're normally going to do a lager at 15, maybe in 12 psi. You can go up as high as maybe 20, but I've talked about this before. People are way over pressurizing their pressure fermentations. That is actually going to do more damage than benefit if you put too much pressure on your beer. So you don't need that much. So when people say, "Oh, I pressure fermented at 60 psi," don't do that. Don't do that. It's low amount of pressure that you need. So 15 psi, like for a lager, is fine. Or you might be using this like on your keg or whatever. But the max, that's where you'd want it for pressure fermenting. However, here's where I was talking about earlier. If you want to naturally carbonate your beer, this is where you come into a problem. Because can you do it? Theoretically, yes. However, you need a dial that can go like 30 to 35 psi, which means you need a different spunding valve that can handle easily double what this can. And as I was just saying a second ago, you don't want to ferment your beer and put it under that much pressure. It's just not good for the yeast. And I'm going to get even more into why it's difficult to naturally carbonate your beer with a spunding valve. I'll get more into it. That's the first reason, is because you need one that can handle significant amount of pressure, and you generally don't even want to put that much pressure on your beer when it's fermenting. All right, so I started making notes about what I would call best practices, and then I just sort of ended up going off the rails. So it started off as best practices, and then I just ended up going all over the place. But here's the deal. Experts recommend still fermenting within the stated fermentation range of the yeast you're using. That's a best practice, right? So if you are fermenting an ale or a lager, the recommendation is that you still try to ferment that ale or lager within the fermentation range of the yeast that you have. You can use the high end of the range. So if you don't have any way to control your fermentation temperature, first of all, I would suggest you try to get that. That should be more important than almost anything else. Fermentation temperature control is the game changer when it comes to brewing beer. But you could go with an ale yeast that has a high end on it if you're doing an ale. Maybe it lets you go up to 75 Fahrenheit. And then you can put that under pressure at 75, and it will help suppress the off flavors you would normally get, the esters and whatnot, by fermenting at that high a temperature. All right, why pressure fermenting works to lager a beer at a higher temperature? Why does it work? You know, when I say a higher temperature, remember what I was saying, it's still within the range of that yeast. Well, the reason lagers take longer to ferment isn't due to the yeast strain itself, but it's due to the colder fermentation temperature that slows down the yeast process. Right? It means you can slow it down and ferment much slower. We do this a lot in bread baking, where you put the bread in the refrigerator and just let it slowly ferment overnight. Creates great flavors, by the way. So the reason lager yeast carry this cold temperature recommendation is because the slower fermentation rate suppresses unwanted flavors and otherwise presents normally in these strains. So that's what I was saying, like the colder you ferment, the less off flavors. That's how you get these really crisp, clean beers, because the lagers, what makes a lager really is not having any yeast impact, right? You want the least amount of yeast impact on your lager as possible, normally. That's the whole point. All right, let's move on. I just have a little bit more for today's video. So the cold fermentation for these lagers is also what drives the recommended higher yeast cell count. So a lot of times you'll hear people say, if you're doing a lager, you need to double pitch if it's dry yeast, or you need to add a higher amount of yeast because it's a colder fermentation, it's slower, you need more yeast than what you normally would use. Right, therefore, fermenting under pressure can be used to suppress esters. It gives brewers another method to deal with the lager yeast besides just fermenting cold. Which leads me to my next point, reduced yeast pitching. So fermenting at the bottom end of an ale yeast, so 65 to 68. And that is exactly, by the way, that is exactly where I usually ferment my ales, 65 to 68. This can allow you to drop back on your yeast pitching. When you pressure ferment, don't need as much of you don't need to double up your yeast to pitch your yeast. So if you currently use the rule of thumb of doubling the yeast to pitch for cold fermenting lagers, you can go back to a single dose if you're pitching warm. So if you're pitching at room temperature, like 70 degrees Fahrenheit for your lager, you can just use a regular, pitch, a regular amount of yeast pitch to ferment your lager, because it's going to be under pressure at that temperature, and it will not need the extra yeast. So that saves you some money. Another reason to pressure ferment. All right, I am going to put a hard stop on that, and I will do part 2 of this video next week and finish up talking about, in particular, why it's very difficult to naturally carbonate properly using pressure fermentation. All right, I will see you next week. Looking forward to it. And until then, keep on brewing. Cheers.